Myron Buel and Catherine Richards came from entirely different worlds, yet history would bind their names together in a single court record that still unsettles anyone who reads it. One was a young farm laborer shaped by poverty, isolation, and a restless temperament. The other was a 14-year-old girl whose life revolved around family, routine, and the quiet expectations of rural New York. Their paths crossed not by chance, but by circumstance, and the consequences would echo far beyond a single summer afternoon. Myron Buel was born on September 12, 1857, in Plainfield, a small town in Otsego County, New York. He was one of 5 children, raised on a modest farm that produced just enough to sustain the family, but offered little in the way of advancement. Education in such households was practical rather than aspirational. Myron learned to read, write, and perform basic arithmetic, but schooling ended early, replaced by labor in the fields. Religious instruction was minimal, and moral guidance came largely from observation rather than discipline or structure. By his early teens, Myron's future was already narrowing. Falling agricultural prices in the early 1870s placed strain on small farms throughout the region. His father's land could not support both sons. Myron's elder brother, frail and often ill, remained at home. Myron, stronger and more physically capable, was sent out to find work elsewhere. At 15, he began moving from farm to farm, hired for seasonal labor wherever hands were needed. Those who employed him described him as capable and diligent, though unpredictable. He could work tirelessly for long stretches, yet his mood sometimes shifted without warning. He was known to brood, to withdraw, and on occasion to display sudden emotional reactions that unsettled those around him. Still, such behavior was often overlooked in hired farmhands, especially those who otherwise completed their work. In the autumn of 1877, Myron found employment with John Richards. When that position ended, Richards recommended him to his brother, William Richards, who operated a larger and more prosperous farm. It was there that Myron entered the household that would become the center of his story. William Richards lived with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, Catherine, Maggie, and Owen. The household also included a seamstress, Miss Jones, who worked regularly in the home, and another farm laborer named Daniel Bowen, who lived on the property. The Richards farm functioned with order and routine, and Catherine Mary Richards occupied a central place within it. Catherine was 14 years old. She was described as gentle, well-mannered, and closely attached to her family. Her days were spent between school, household tasks, and the small freedoms afforded to a girl of her age in a rural setting. She was not considered rebellious or headstrong. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness and her reluctance to cause conflict. At first, Myron Buel appeared to fit comfortably into the Richards household. He worked alongside Daniel Bowen in the fields and barns, performed assigned duties without complaint, and earned William Richards' trust. Yet subtle tensions existed beneath the surface. Myron's demeanor toward Catherine was noticed by others, though not immediately understood. He spoke to her more than was customary. On occasion, his words left her visibly distressed. In the months leading up to the summer of 1878, members of the Richards family recalled moments that troubled them only in hindsight. Catherine had been upset after interactions with Myron. Maggie later remembered confronting him, telling him he should be ashamed of his remarks. Myron apologized and asked that nothing be said. At the time, the incidents were treated as uncomfortable but resolved. No one believed they would escalate into something irreversible. Tuesday, June 25, 1878, began as an ordinary day. William Richards was away on business. After lunch, Margaret Richards prepared to travel to West Winfield. She asked Daniel Bowen to hitch the horse, and Myron assisted. Before leaving, she noted nothing unusual. Catherine remained at home with Miss Jones. Maggie was at school. After Mrs. Cole, Richards departed. Daniel Bowen and Myron walked to the hop fields to continue their work. The afternoon was warm and labor was steady. Several hours later, Myron complained that his rubber boots were too hot. He told Bowen he would return to the house to change into leather ones. Bowen watched him leave, expecting him back shortly. Myron's absence stretched longer than expected. When he returned, he explained that the Richards mare and colt had escaped into the field and needed to be driven back into the paddock. Bowen accepted the explanation without suspicion. The men resumed their work and completed the afternoon's tasks. As evening approached, they returned from the fields and noticed the young bull was loose. Concerned it might cause damage, they attempted to drive it back toward the barn. It was there, inside the barn, that they made a discovery that would end the day in horror. Catherine Richards lay on the barn floor, motionless. At first, neither man fully comprehended what they were seeing. When they approached, it became clear that she was dead. Shock overtook them. They carried her body into the house, uncertain how to proceed. Myron suggested riding to West Winfield to notify Mrs. Richards. He left but failed to find her and returned to the farm. That night passed in stunned silence. The following day, the community gathered. Catherine's body was viewed at church, and neighbors mourned with the Richards family. Initially, the explanation circulated that the bull had caused her death. It was a terrible thought, but one that offered some sense of accident rather than intent. That explanation would not survive examination. Before burial, Catherine's body was inspected more closely. The injuries told a different story. Marks around her neck indicated strangulation. A deep bruise stained her temple. Abrasions across her body revealed a struggle. Each finding dismantled the idea of an accident. Catherine Richards had been deliberately killed. As that truth settled, attention turned inward. Suspicion began to focus on the one person who had been alone on the property during a critical window of time. The man who had left the fields. The man who had spoken to Catherine in ways that had upset her. The man who had offered explanations that now seemed too convenient. Myron Buel. Once the truth of Catherine Richards' death became impossible to deny, the Richards farm ceased to be a place of mourning alone and became a place of inquiry. Word spread quickly through the surrounding countryside that the girl had not died by accident. The community that had gathered to grieve now gathered to speculate, and with speculation came suspicion. The first formal step toward understanding what had happened came with a medical examination. Dr. James Rose, a physician with more than 4 decades of experience, examined Catherine's body on the evening of June 25th. His findings were disturbing. The marks upon her neck formed a distinct pattern consistent with strangulation. There was a crescent-shaped mark on her shoulder, bruising on her temple, and abrasions across her body that suggested force and restraint. 2 days later, a more detailed dissection confirmed his conclusions. While there was no definitive evidence of severe internal injury beyond the neck, Dr. Rose stated plainly that death had been caused by strangulation and that improper interference had occurred at or near the time of death. Another physician, Dr. Bassett, assisted in the examination and corroborated these findings. Together, their testimony erased any remaining belief that the bull had killed the girl. The injuries were not consistent with an animal attack. The crime was human in origin. As investigators reconstructed the day's events, attention centered on a narrow window in the afternoon when Catherine was alone on the farm. Margaret Richards had left for West Winfield shortly after lunch. Maggie was at school. Daniel Bowen and Myron Buel were working in the hop fields. Miss Jones, the seamstress, remained inside the house. It was during this period that Catherine died. Daniel Bowen's account soon became critical. He described Myron's departure from the fields under the pretense of changing boots. He noted the unusually long absence and the explanation given upon Myron's return. Bowen also recalled prior conversations with Myron that now carried new weight. Weeks earlier, Myron had spoken of a relative who used straps or cords to render young girls unconscious. At the time, Bowen had not understood the comment's significance. In retrospect, it chilled him. The condition of the barn further fueled suspicion. Investigators examined the space carefully. Blood was found on a doorpost and on a floorboard. A rope and strap bearing dark stains were discovered near the milking stall. Though the defense would later argue that such stains were common on working farms, their presence aligned with the medical evidence of strangulation. The bull itself was examined, and its horns showed no blood. Tests demonstrated that the animal could not have freed itself from its enclosure, contradicting the original claim that it had broken loose and caused harm. As these details accumulated, the focus narrowed further. Myron Buel was the only person whose movements that afternoon remained partly unaccounted for. Witnesses placed him near the barn. Others recalled seeing him in emotional distress in the weeks prior. Members of the Richards family came forward with their own recollections. Owen Richards testified that Myron had once told him Catherine held a grudge against him. When Owen asked Catherine about it, she explained that Myron had insulted her in a deeply inappropriate manner. Maggie Richards described similar incidents. On one occasion, she returned home to find her sister crying. Catherine again attributed her distress to Myron's words. Maggie confronted him directly, telling him he should be ashamed. He apologized and asked her not to tell anyone. These accounts did not describe violence, but they established a pattern of behavior that unsettled both family and investigators. Catherine's discomfort had not been fleeting. It had been repeated. As public sentiment hardened, Myron sought legal counsel. He traveled to Winfield to speak with an attorney, perhaps sensing that suspicion had already settled upon him. While there, a deputy sheriff located him and took him into custody. He was escorted back to face a coroner's inquest, where witnesses began formally recounting what they had seen and heard. The inquest painted a grim picture. Witnesses placed Myron at key locations on the property. John Davis testified that he had visited the Richards farm that afternoon and seen both Catherine and Miss Jones inside the house. He also saw Myron in the barn and later near the stable. Evan Jones testified that he observed the Richards mare and colt loose in the meadow between 3 and 4 o'clock and drove them back himself, casting doubt on Myron's claim that he alone had handled the situation. George Ellsworth, who questioned Myron shortly after the death, testified about inconsistencies in his explanations. Ellsworth claimed to have followed Myron's tracks, found bloodstains, and determined that the bull could not have caused Catherine's injuries. While the defense challenged the certainty of these findings, they contributed to an increasingly damning narrative. At the conclusion of the inquest, Myron Buel was brought before Justice Williamson. On July 2nd, exactly 1 week after Catherine's death, he was committed to Cooperstown County Jail to await the grand jury's decision. His incarceration did little to ease public tension. Newspapers reported each development in detail. Rumors circulated freely. Sympathy for the Richards family deepened, while hostility toward Myron intensified. When the grand jury convened, they did not hesitate. After reviewing the evidence presented, they returned a formal indictment charging Myron Buel with the murder of Catherine Mary Richards. The charge elevated the case from suspicion to certainty in the public mind. He would now stand trial for his life. As summer turned to autumn, preparations began. Attorneys were retained. Witness lists were assembled. The Richards family endured their grief under constant scrutiny, while Myron remained confined, isolated from the community he had once worked among. Whatever uncertainty lingered in private minds, the machinery of justice had begun moving in one direction. The question was no longer whether Catherine Richards had been murdered. That had been settled. The question now was whether the young man in the county jail was the one who had done it. The trial of Myron Buel opened in February of 1879 and immediately drew attention far beyond Otsego County. Newspapers reported the proceedings in detail, and residents from surrounding towns traveled to Cooperstown to witness what many already believed would be the final accounting of Catherine Richards' death. Each day the courtroom filled early. Every bench was occupied by farmers, merchants, and families who had followed the case since the summer. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with expectation and judgment. The prosecution was led by Attorney Bundy, who framed the case as one built not on a single piece of evidence, but on a pattern of conduct, opportunity, and intent. From the outset, he argued that the crime was not impulsive but deliberate. Catherine Richards, he told the jury, had been singled out, isolated, and killed during a narrow window when her family was absent and the accused was alone with her. The defense was conducted by Attorney Morgan, assisted by James Lyons. Their strategy was clear from the beginning. They would argue that the case against Myron Buel rested entirely on circumstantial evidence, unreliable witness recollections, and assumptions shaped by grief rather than proof. They emphasized that no one had seen Myron commit the crime, and that alternative explanations had been prematurely dismissed. Margaret Richards was among the first witnesses called. Her testimony was measured but emotionally devastating. She described the routine of the morning of June 25th, the decision to travel to West Winfield, and the trust she had placed in those left behind. As she spoke of Catherine's health and character, her composure faltered. When she described returning home to learn of her daughter's death, the courtroom fell silent. Her words did not accuse directly, but they carried the weight of irreversible loss. Owen Richards followed. He testified that weeks before the murder, Myron had told him Catherine held resentment toward him. Owen recounted an incident in the barn when Myron was crying and confessed he had asked Catherine to forgive him for something he had said. When Owen asked Catherine about it later, she told him the words had been inappropriate and deeply upsetting. This testimony established motive in the prosecution's view, suggesting resentment and fixation rather than mere misunderstanding. Maggie Richards' testimony reinforced her brother's account. She described returning home on an earlier occasion to find Catherine crying in the kitchen. When asked what was wrong, Catherine told her Myron had insulted her. Maggie confronted him and demanded an explanation. According to her testimony, Myron apologized and pleaded with her not to tell anyone. Maggie also recalled seeing him crying in the barn on another occasion, claiming that both sisters held grudges against him. To the prosecution, these moments revealed escalating emotional instability. Daniel Bowen then took the stand. He described the events of June 25th in detail, including Myron's departure from the hop fields, his prolonged absence, and the explanation he offered upon returning. Bowen repeated the earlier statement Myron had made about rendering young girls unconscious, testimony that drew visible reaction from the courtroom. Bowen also described the bull, noting that it had attacked him weeks earlier, but was unlikely to have caused Catherine's injuries. Additional witnesses placed Myron near the barn during critical moments. John Davis testified that he saw Catherine and Miss Jones inside the house around 3 o'clock and spoke briefly with Myron in the barn. Evan Jones testified that he drove the mare and colt back into the pasture himself, contradicting Myron's account. George Ellsworth described finding bloodstains and tracks matching Myron's boots, as well as discovering a rope and strap bearing stains. Medical testimony followed. Dr. Rose detailed his examination, describing the marks on Catherine's neck and body. He stated clearly that death was caused by strangulation. Dr. Bassett corroborated his findings, noting abrasions and bruising inconsistent with an animal attack. Though neither physician could identify a weapon with certainty, both agreed the injuries resulted from deliberate human action. When the prosecution rested, the defense began dismantling the narrative piece by piece. Attorney Morgan emphasized inconsistencies in witness testimony. He argued that blood stains on a working farm were not unusual and that no definitive link connected those stains to the crime. He questioned whether memory, shaped by shock and grief, could be trusted months after the fact. Witnesses for the defense testified about Myron's habits and health. Several confirmed that he suffered frequent nosebleeds, offering an alternative explanation for blood found on his boots. Others described his tendency to leave employment suddenly, particularly when distressed or affected by drink, suggesting his behavior after the murder did not necessarily indicate guilt. Myron Buel then took the stand. He spoke calmly, answering questions without hesitation. He described his upbringing, his work on farms, and his duties at the Richards property. He denied harboring any infatuation with Catherine and denied insulting her deliberately. He rejected the prosecution's claim that he had released the horses to lure her to the barn. When asked about the bloodstains, he again explained his frequent nosebleeds, particularly when milking cows. Under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed him on timelines and movements. Myron maintained that he had gone to the house only to change his boots and deal with the horses. He denied any violent intent. His demeanor remained composed, though observers later noted a tension in his expression. In closing arguments, Attorney Bundy reconstructed the prosecution's theory in full. He described a calculated sequence: the release of the animals, the isolation of Catherine, the use of a rope, the fatal blow, and the staging involving the bull. He urged the jury to see not individual facts, but the pattern they formed together. Every action, he argued, pointed to Myron Buel. Attorney Lyons responded with equal intensity. He warned the jury against mistaking suspicion for certainty. He reminded them that no witness had seen the crime, and that circumstantial evidence required caution. He argued that grief had colored interpretation, and that the presence of other individuals on the property created reasonable doubt. To convict, he said, would be to replace proof with assumption. When the judge completed his instructions, the jury retired. They deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stood. The foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty. When the jury returned its verdict, the courtroom remained silent. Myron Buel stood motionless as the word guilty settled over the room. His sisters wept openly, while members of the Richards family sat rigid, absorbing a conclusion that brought neither relief nor peace. The legal process moved swiftly from that moment forward. The defense immediately objected, arguing that the jury had not been fully instructed on the distinctions between murder and manslaughter. The judge denied the motion. Myron Buel was sentenced to death. The decision did not end the case. His attorneys filed appeals, arguing procedural errors and emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the evidence. These appeals were heard and rejected. A final effort was made to secure executive clemency. The governor was petitioned for a reprieve, urged to consider doubts raised during trial and the irreversible nature of the sentence. That petition, too, was denied. With no legal avenues remaining, Myron Buel faced the reality of his sentence. It was only after the final appeal failed that the case took its final, decisive turn. In the weeks before his execution, Myron Buel requested the counsel of Reverend Hiller, a Methodist minister who became his spiritual advisor. During one of these meetings, Myron confessed fully. He admitted that he had deliberately planned the killing of Catherine Richards. According to his confession, he released the horses to create a reason for Catherine to come to the barn. Once there, he strangled her and struck her. He placed her body where the bull usually slept and then released the animal, intending to make it appear responsible for her death. The confession confirmed the prosecution's theory almost precisely. Myron further admitted to setting fire to his father's barn 3 years earlier, though he offered no explanation for that act. The confession was reported widely and ended any lingering public debate about his guilt. What the trial had failed to conclusively establish, his own words now sealed. On Friday, November 14, 1879, Myron Buel was executed in Cooperstown. Witnesses described him as calm. He made no public statement beyond acknowledging his fate. With his death, the legal case closed. After burial in a cemetery in Clarksville, his body became the subject of a grim footnote. An offer was made to purchase the remains for medical study, which was officially denied. Days later, the grave was disturbed. The body was removed, transported to Albany, and used for anatomical research at Albany Medical Hospital, a practice not uncommon in the 19th century, but deeply unsettling to the public. Catherine Richards was 14 years old when she died. Her family endured the remainder of their lives marked by loss. The Richards farm returned to its routines, but nothing within it was ever ordinary again. The barn where Catherine died became a place people avoided. Her name remained spoken softly, often followed by silence. The case of Myron Buel stands as a stark example of 19th century rural justice. It reveals how communities responded to violence, how circumstantial evidence was weighed, and how confession ultimately eclipsed doubt. It also underscores how limited understanding of behavior and mental disturbance was at the time, offering little insight into prevention or rehabilitation. What remains undeniable is the reality of the crime itself. A young girl lost her life in a place she trusted. A young man destroyed his own future through deliberate action. The machinery of justice delivered its final judgment, and history recorded the outcome without mercy. Myron Buel's name survives not as a mystery, but as a certainty. Catherine Richards' name survives as the reason the case is remembered at all.